That's Facts and Money was the name of the podcast, that asked the listeners to provide lists of books on work in the working class. And then she went and looked at that list, and?
So I actually found out about the list because somebody wrote a comment on a blog that Tim Strangelman wrote, and I went to look at the list and discovered that what was on the list that general listeners to this podcast were recommending to help people understand class was not the stuff that we read. It was not the work that in this field we turn to. It was things like Hillbilly Elegy, it was things like White Trash, it was, there were a couple of novels that a lot of us have written about, but, the kinds of work that we talk about a lot of the time just was absent. And that, for me, made very clear that we're doing some great work that the world out there needs to know more about, and that we need to do more to get the ways of approaching class that Working Class Studies does to a larger audience.
And more specifically to us as Working Class Studies people, is that it's essential to field building. Not only taking our work outside of Academe, but also even within Academe to various types of departments who may or may not acknowledge that there is such a thing as working class studies. The provost at Georgetown had a conversation with Sherry and said, what's working class studies?
Actually, my dean.
Your dean.
I don't think the provost is paying that much attention.
But the dean could be. But the dean.
That's the room next door with Randy Christopher.
So there has to be a greater sort of attention to getting the word out, not only within Academe, but also to the outside community. So, and the ultimate goal, as we always have said in working class studies, is to change the discourse, the culture, and policies. And if we're going to do that, we need to get a wider audience. So we've divided this workshop into two parts. One, lacking a better term, we call translation. And the second one is about working specifically with the media.
All right. So before we go into the most workshop section of this workshop, that is the part where you're actually going to be doing things, I do want to say this is being live streamed. There will be some moments as we go along where I will ask you to talk a little bit about the writing that you're doing while you're here. You can ask to have the live stream stopped while you speak if you would rather not share your wisdom with anybody beyond who's in this room. I will just say that given the spirit of this workshop, I hope you don't do that, but whatever. So in my role as the editor of Working Class Perspectives, I spend 2 or 3 hours almost every week of my life working with my colleagues to help them write blogs that will go on our site. And we view our blog as reaching a very mixed audience. We reach a lot of academics. If you looked at our mailing list, you'd see lots of .edu or .ac email addresses. But we also reach a large number of journalists. That's part of how we have tried to get working class studies out into the world. We started the blog in 2008 with the goal of having working class studies be the place that the media would come to ask questions about class and work and labor in the United States. And so we've been very careful about cultivating a list of journalists. We also have a lot of readers who are not academics at all, who are artists and activists and workers. And so one of our tasks is always to be translating our work for other audiences. So what I want to share today is some of the things I've learned from working with my colleagues, with the hope that I can give you some advice about how to do this, and then a couple of exercises that I hope will let you leave here today with half of a blog written. And then you can come and tell us what you're writing about, and we'll see if we can fit you into the schedule. So but that's kind of where we're headed. Before we go into the details, I also want to acknowledge a key issue here, which is that for academics, starting to write for public audiences can be a terrifying thing. In the writing we do most of the time, we are kind of cushioned by a couple of things. We're cushioned by the fact that we know that we're writing to an audience that shares a certain body of knowledge with us. and a set of values and expectations about how we write. And we've been very well trained. I mean, think back, most of us went through graduate school, and somewhere along the line somebody said, you have to do a lit review in this way. This is the form of an article in this field. These are the references that you have to make, because if you don't make them, I mean, I literally had colleagues when I was working on the book I just finished saying things to me about, well, if you don't cite X, Y, and Z, we won't take you seriously. So we all have this way of writing, and it doesn't necessarily feel safe while we're doing it, but it really, you know, by the time you get out of graduate school, you've learned to rely on the comfort of that. And when you go out to write for a public audience, it's a very different world. Because most of the things that we rest our voices on, in some ways, you can't use. You can't use that offhand citation, because people won't know. David, we had this last week when he had made a reference in the blog that we posted on Monday to say, you know, as Adorno says, and I was like, can you say a little bit more about who this is? At least like use his full name and put a link so that readers can find out who you're talking about. If you were just talking to the people in the room, we might all know that, but you're not, right? And so part of this is just habit. We're so used to being able to talk that way. So you got to be able to move to a different space. So I've put up here some distinctions between academic writing and journalistic writing. And I want to make clear that this isn't just about style. We'll get to style before we're done. It's really about the purpose of your writing, and therefore the audience that you're writing to, and those things kind of feed each other. So if you're writing to your colleagues, your goal most of the time is to join and actually intervene in an ongoing critical conversation among people who share a particular body of knowledge, a disciplinary set of practices, theories, ideas, values, all of that kind of thing, as well as sets of conventions that say you must write in certain ways. And because you want to change that critical conversation, you have to write in these particular ways. Among other things, you have to demonstrate your credentials. And you demonstrate your credentials not by saying, well, here's where I come from, here's what my experience was. How do you demonstrate your credentials as an academic? What do you do in writing to say to people, take me seriously?
Publication. You quoted Adorno.
You quote Adorno. Yeah, you actually don't list your publications, because I wouldn't in an article say, I am the author of X, Y, and Z, right? That might go in my cover letter, but in the article, I'm not going to do that. You cite people. You talk about the ongoing conversation. You use particular language, because that says to your colleagues, here's who I am. I'm one of you. And now when you turn to write for the public, all of that is useless to you. In fact, if you do that when you write for a journalistic audience, people will say, oh, this is one of those academic eggheads. They don't really understand the real world. So we can't do that. In journalistic writing, you're trying to intervene in public conversations. Yes?
Yeah, sure. I just want a quick point. I think people should know historically that academic writing has gotten more academic.
Yes.
In the last few years.
Yes.
That if you look at sociological writing from 30 years ago,
Right.
it really is far more understandable by a broad, not broad sort of completely broad, by an educated audience. You can, if you go into some of the classical sociological studies from the early 60s about poverty and social class. I was just reading Mira Komarovsky's Blue Collar Marriage from 1961. Completely accessible to students. If you read a similar book published by a university press, and this is sort of actually the intersect between our work lives and what's going on with neoliberalism, because we actually are penalized for writing understandable language, which didn't used to be the case.
Yeah, I actually had a really interesting conversation a number of years ago with a colleague in the other field that I work in. I'd sent him an article that I was working on where I had cited his work. And he read the article and he wrote back and he had a number of comments on the article, and then he ended by saying, how do you get away with writing like this? Like, yeah, you know, because we do get penalized for that. One more short story and then we'll get back to the thing. My department has recently been revising its merit review process, or the way that we judge each other's work. And This is part of the anxiety that goes with doing public writing. They assigned a certain number of points to each different type of thing. You know, a book got 100 points, and an edited collection got 50, and an article in a top-level peer-reviewed journal got whatever. How many points do you get for writing an op-ed or a blog or anything like that?
0.
You got it. Not a 1. You spend your time doing that, you're taking time away from your real work. So all of that lies behind this too. So we're writing for the public, we're trying to change the way the public thinks and talks about things. And I'm very conscious in the blog that what we're trying to do is not only help academics, but help people out in the world change the way they think about these things. The same way we use scholarly references in academic writing, in journalistic writing, we're much more likely to use experiences, examples, stories are absolutely crucial. Our goal is to persuade readers not to change the way they do scholarship on something, but to get involved in a particular issue. Here, instead of establishing our membership in the field, we're trying to make a connection through the way we write. And all of that changes the way you think about what you're doing. So I have 2 exercises that I want us to go through to help you think about doing this. So we're going to test John's cultural, how tuned in he is to cultural history versus everybody else. Does anybody but me remember Mad Libs from when you were a kid?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. See, I'm not making this up. John was saying, what's a Mad Lib? So for those of you who don't remember, when I was a kid, this was like a common game. That they published these books that would have like a little story. You know, once upon a time, the blank bus, you know, and you would fill in the blanks and you would come up with funny stories. And so this is the version of that for writing for the public.
Still look like a typo to me.
Essentially, yeah, he's like, what are yeah, anyway. So several things that you can answer fairly quickly to figure out what it is you have to say. Let me give you an example. I did one from one of the blogs that we ran just a couple of weeks ago. Allison Hurst did a terrific piece on the college ranking systems that circulate in the United States. So if I were Allison filling this out, I would have said, it's so much easier to channel Allison than to make up one of my own, because my research on how class differences play out in higher education shows that college ranking systems distort public understanding of what higher education offers, doesn't serve the needs of working class people. I believe that, and the who here is important. So it isn't just, I believe that X is true. It's like, I believe that this matters to some particular group of people. So in her case, I believe that working class people who are considering where to apply for college should, what's the thing you want to have happen, and because, which is part of the why does this matter. I'm racing through this because I want to give you time to write. So I just passed out to everybody a blank Mad Lib. Your task is to take 5 minutes, think about, oh, hang on. I was going to go, there we go. Take 5 minutes and fill it out for something you think that you do or that you're interested in that would be worth sharing with a public audience. 5 minutes.
It's a good exercise.
It is. Take about another minute to finish up, and then I'll ask you to have a conversation with someone near you. So if the person next to you is also done, you can start chatting. I think people have got another minute. All right, so wherever you are, find a partner, switch sheets, have a little bit of a conversation about two things. One is just about how this exercise worked for you. Was it good? Was it bad? What did you struggle with? Well, but also about the topics that you're coming up with and the approaches that you've got. And if you're sitting off on the side, come and join the middle of the room, because otherwise you're going to be talking to yourself.
What is this?
Regeneration.
Regeneration. Okay. All right. Former industrial area.
Something. Wider area. I believe that academics want to make the meaningful, sustainable with communities of region in mind. They should acknowledge the difference. Acknowledge the difference.
Acknowledge.
Yeah.
Forgive me, but I'm an old-time editor. I've edited. Acknowledge, I think, could be stronger. If you forgive my editing.
Yeah.
You should grab hold of it and open it and unpack it and sort of dive into it.
Yeah, no, I agree.
That's enough. They should be an active role.
Because the way they're doing it, because different regions have different identities, there's different ways that they can use those passes or not, or that those industrial
I think it's because it can help personally they can explore their to understand where they came from, their enemies, and how they can fight for a better life for themselves. Maybe with a different industry. Maybe they have to find a lot of people. And that's not like you, but I think they come up with why you think this is for that.
No, I agree about fighting for those community regional identities for work.
Also for their mental health,
Yeah.
for their family health, for their children's well-being. I mean, depressed parents, depressed kids, and also for their children to understand their roots and embrace them. Fight so it can be it's going to help families, to me, family solidarity, lots of
So you should question who this regeneration is for. So for academics and
Good exercise. It focuses the mind.
That's what we've tried to do. Go ahead, we've learned a lot.
Kind of the simplest way to do it.
Yeah, it's true. Tear it down. It's an art.
1,000 words. You got a little bit more, you lucky dog. Yes, you did. But you went through the process with sharing.
Yeah.
And you
All right. Hello. As a good friend of mine in that other field that I work in says regularly when he's doing workshops, stop learning and listen to me. Because you do the best learning when you're talking with each other, I think. How did it go? How was this?
Good.
What worked? What didn't work? What did you struggle with? Yeah.
Paul's one straight away when we started talking. He's got a great egg to hang his talk about working class college students.
Yeah.
And he's got a great one about a single mother who had who was confronted with either staying at home on a snow day to look after a 3-year-old or
Having the reins taken off in class.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem was, it's a great story. I told them after I filled out this.
yeah,
Right?
Yeah.
but that gets to your point about having the story peg.
Right. And we're actually going there in the next exercise. You're anticipating, Tim. You've been too well trained as a blogger. That there needs to be a story, right? What else? What worked? What didn't?
I think I just thought like the rubric here. I mean, I think that worked very well. And I mean, I did something that I've been thinking about writing about for a while, so maybe it was a little easier for me. But I also like the breakdown of saying like who is doing this and you know, helping to focus that.
Yeah, and I think part of what I like about the Mad Lib concept is that it really does make you focus and really try to encourage you to be concrete about things. I was talking to a couple folks about the fact that the why does it matter in some ways is the hardest part to get right. And I was saying to these guys in the back, as academics, we're often encouraged to have our why does it matter be things like, people will understand this better, or it'll change the world. And yeah, I love all of that, but it's not a strong thing to make a claim for in public writing, to be able to say, it will change the world by generating X outcome, is kind of where we want to go. So one of the things that I hope you will do with this concept as you use it to plan things is to try to make every answer as concrete and specific as you can. The more concrete and specific, the better prepared you are to make that case to somebody. And the clearer you are that there's a reason why we should care about it. Because it's the reason that I think, that it's a reason and a story that will drive all of this. Other comments on this, other thoughts? Tim?
Well, I think the default, certainly for me, as an academic, is the thing you say is because it's complicated.
Yes.
And that's probably true, but not the right thing for you.
Exactly. Yeah. Because just saying to most readers it's complicated is like, well, yeah. And I should do what? Or even to say, this is, we were talking about Paul's example. This will honor students. He was talking about paying attention to what students bring into the classroom, and the idea that this will honor their experience. Well, it does. Why should we care about that? What does that do to improve the quality of education for working class students? You make that bigger and somewhat more concrete leap. Lisa?
I think we need to stop sort of flipping this around, because one of the things in academic writing and not in classroom, because students actually want to change the world and they want to make the, you know, they don't want to hear, and this is complicated. They want to, you know, I think we need to start flipping this around and forcing academic writing to start making it stand.
I completely agree, and I mean, we could do another whole workshop
Yeah.
on how do we engage our students in doing this kind of writing, which is a lot of
Because
the
our
work that I
students
do.
will do this sort of writing.
They will.
Then we kick it out of them.
Exactly, yeah, we train them to do the same kinds of things that we were trained to do. Paul?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found in doing public writing, that I
I think it's really clear.
have to use an academic writing as a historian, as a little bit
Focus.
of leeway from this, is starting with a concrete story. And I think, you know, the story I told Tim, that's the lead.
Yeah.
Right, not that I think this is the issue.
Right.
So I think, and I think for Tim's, it starts back to the problem of deindustrialization. The lead is, this factory closed down, how does this fit in?
Right.
You know, and so, you know, like I was
Why should we
elsewhere,
care?
my student lost her job at this factory because of the factory closed down and moved to China. And what does that mean to northern Indiana?
Yeah.
So I think one of the keys may be to bring public audiences, which are really discouraged from an academia. I think, you know, tell you how discouraging academic writing has become, because you're not supposed to do that.
That's right.
You're not supposed to bring people in and saying, you know, I know this person.
Yeah.
And anybody who reads an academic paper, an academic who reads that saying, well, this person is clearly doing it wrong.
Right.
Whereas in public writing, you're saying, it's more like a conversation on the street.
Yeah.
Hey, you know, I know this person. I do this.
Yeah.
That's my student who lost her job. Say, oh yeah, you know, Amy, you know, she's a really brilliant student. She got all A's and she was great, and she didn't know she was college materials, and nobody ever told her she was smart. And she comes to this about it. She tells me the first meeting, well, this is a factory rat. I don't know what I'm doing. And meanwhile, she has all this stuff that she knows. So I have a conversation with someone, you know, I met the students here. She was great. Look at all they did.
Yeah.
So the writing becomes more like we have a conversation in the street, which we all know how to do, rather than the writing for people like us.
Yeah. So 2 quick things on that. One is, I do want to say that I think in this field, we are more likely to tell stories. You know, I have a piece coming out in this handbook that Tim and Christy and Michelle are editing on the use of personal narrative in working class scholarly writing. We as a field have actually made that a large part of what we do. So we of course are superior to all other academics. Finally, that's something that we should get, no, we've got lots that we should get attention for, but we actually do that pretty well in this field, I think. And yet, we still struggle to turn around and do it for public audiences. Second, I want to make clear that the Mad Lib is not an outline of your blog. It's getting clear in your head, what am I trying to do in writing this blog? Now you got to figure out, how do I turn it into a piece that's going to engage readers, and that's what the next handout is about. Because there's a kind of standard structure that we do over and over again with a lot of variation, but this is the basic outline. You start with a hook. Sometimes it's a story. Often it's a story. Sometimes it's here's this thing that happened last week, or here's this thing we all know about. So Alison Hurst's piece, for example, on the college rankings, started with, we all know that there are all of these college ranking systems out there, and kind of reminding us of familiar knowledge, and then going into offering a critique of those and moving on from there. David's piece that ran on Monday began with a reference to the exhibit that was opening this week, right, at the Venice Biennale on this housing project that is now being displayed as art and artifact. So capturing it in the moment. But there needs to be something concrete. Our pieces are the most engaging, and this is especially true if you're thinking about doing something like an op-ed for a local newspaper. Even in our blogs, we regularly have things that start with, here's the issue. Not the strongest start, but we do that every now and then. But if you're writing for a newspaper, if you're writing for a general interest magazine, you need the story or the hook of some kind at the beginning. Why would somebody be interested in this? How am I going to get them in the door? From there, it's helpful. You don't always have to do this, but it's helpful to position yourself. Again, that idea of, here's my knowledge. This is a difficult part for academics sometimes, because what we want to do is say, in my research, and let me spend 2 paragraphs describing to you the group of people that I interviewed and what their history is and how the, no. In my interviews with 25 former steelworkers, and that may be all you have to do, or in my, again I'm going back to Paul's, in my X number of years of teaching working class students, this is what I observed. Or in my neighborhood last week, this thing happened. So the story can be about yourself, that is both about pulling people in and about helping people understand why they should listen to you. What is it that you bring to the situation? And sometimes that's the place to say, I'm an expert in this. So again, I refer you back to Alison Hurst's piece from a couple of weeks ago, where after talking about, we have all of these rankings of colleges, and I think they're a problem. And part of what she says is, as a sociologist, I have particular problems with this, and goes on to lay out what those problems are. But she positions herself with some expertise, but not with her biography, and not with a full discussion of the kind of research that she does. But she does kind of say to people, you know, here's why you should listen to me. You know, here's where I'm coming from. Often you then need to clarify the issue. So you take the story and connect it with the larger issue that you think that story illustrates, and try to help people understand why should we care about this issue briefly. As you develop it, then you're going to turn to more specific evidence, and that might be a series of stories. It might be a series of examples of here different possible policies that we could do with this. It might be, you know, different examples from the history. You know, there's a piece that I wrote a couple of years ago about why I thought people broadly in the US should be reading some of the novels that I was writing about. What did I do? I talked about 3 different novels. Said, you know, here's one, and here's what I think it would offer you, and if you looked at this other one, this would offer you this other thing. Very much like the thing that those of us who are college writing teachers in the US complain about constantly, the 5-paragraph essay. It's sort of saying, you know, you have several examples of things that are developing and explaining and clarifying what you're doing, and then you got to get to the so what. Like, why should we care? Now, for our blog, we often encourage people to do a why should we care that is either why should the general public or some particular group outside of academia care about this. So legislators should care. John has written a whole series of pieces over the last year about what's happening with the Democratic Party, and the ending of that is often the Democratic Party, in some cases, the Democratic Party in Ohio should do X, Y, and Z. You know, if they want to win in November, here's what they have to do. That it becomes pretty concrete and pretty specific at the end. Think about what you want is people to walk away with an action that they can take. That action might just be go read more about this, but there ought to be an action and a sense that people feel like, yeah, this matters, I should know more about this. So here too, you've got a blank template in front of you. I don't expect you in the next 10 minutes that I'm going to give you to write a whole blog, but I'm actually going to give you 7 minutes to just fill out, make some notes on this. Think of this as a tool to translate, Translation 101. So we're translating from academic to public. You're now translating from the Mad Lib to what might be the outline of a blog. So take a few minutes to do that, and again, I'll give you some time to talk to each other when you're done.
Should we do the same subject? Should we like
If you want to start over, you can. I think the theory here is that the Mad Lib would have helped you figure out what you want to write about, and now you can think about how do I want to write that. You could probably turn the live streaming off because nothing much is going to be happening for the next 10 minutes. It's up to you. Otherwise, you just have images of me pacing back and forth in front of the room. Take about one more minute. Get as far as you can. So however far you got, have another just about a 1 to 2 minute conversation with your partner. How did it go moving from the Mad Lib to beginning to imagine the outline of a blog? Take just a couple minutes to check in, and then we'll chat and begin to wrap this part up.
That's where it was. Yeah, the story being same
And so what was it now?
I were just watching it like you remember it in the force well, not officially, like it's supposed to be in the conversation. We're going there and of course I'm
All right. These sound like great conversations, and they could probably go on very productively for a long while, and I'm sorry to cut them off, but I want to make sure John has enough time to talk about the other half of this, because if your work is successful,
This is really good.
journalists will start to call you. So I want to make sure we get to that. But I want to say one more thing. First of all, any quick responses on the outline, this part of it? Work well, not well?
I had trouble with the development area.
Yep.
Because, I sort of felt like, well, I've already said that, and I wasn't sure what to put in there that was not restating.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is interesting that I didn't say about the difference between academic and journalistic writing is about scale. Ordinarily, when I'm writing an article for an academic journal, or even when I'm putting together a presentation for a conference, I have 10 pages, 15 pages, 20 pages, 30 pages in which to work. A typical op-ed is about 800 words. I fight with contributors to Working Class Perspectives all the time about keeping pieces under 1,500. My goal, I started out saying, can we do them at 1,000? And I very quickly learned that people were not going to go for that. Some people do. Talk to Sarah Atfield. She's a master at getting it done in 800 words. But most of us are not used to that. So development turns out to be pretty short. And it may very well be that in the process of positioning yourself, clarifying the issue, and developing, they aren't 3 separate sections. There's kind of overlap. But just keep in mind you have very little space to do this. So what feels like development in academic writing here is like, let me just tell you this brief thing and move on. Scott?
Out of 800 to 1,000 words, do you have a sense of how many words, generally speaking, go in each section?
No. It depends on the case.
But generally speaking,
I would say generally, it's about maybe 50% up to clarifying the issue, another 35 to 40% of development, and 10% of closing out and so what. That's a rough estimate, but it depends on the topic, and it depends on how much of explaining it and supporting it you're doing in the clarifying the issue part. Because sometimes these two particularly run together the same way the hook and positioning yourself often run together.
It also changes on the form. Journalism is
Yeah.
800 words for newspapers. That's, you get outside of that, and it is a zero-sum game. The editors will just...
Yep.
Blogs is 1,200 words. That's a sort of,
Yeah.
in most situations.
Right.
And that's why Sherry's number, she's been pretty brutal.
Yes,
when it comes
as multiple people in this room can attest,
that,
I'm a savage editor.
And if it's really bad, she gives it to me first. I keep thinking, the guy standing.
Yeah.
3,000 words, we told you 1,200.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because it's,
Paul?
yeah.
I wouldn't worry about
It's
the
really true, yeah.
length of any part of it,
So that
because
could be
the structure
the title.
here is applicable to much longer.
This is an article
Yes.
about
Absolutely.
Chapters or.
Yeah, or a longer scale magazine piece. I mean, John and I have a piece that we think is coming out someday soon in The Nation that is 3,000 words.
25 to 28 now.
But that much of it follows this kind of structure, but is longer. So as I say to my first year writing students about that 5-paragraph essay thing, which some of you may not know what I'm talking about, but it's kind of the standard outline. It says you have an introduction where you make a claim, you have 3 reasons, no more than 3, no fewer than 3. You develop your 3 reasons, and then you have a conclusion where you restate everything you've just said. And those of us who teach college writing spend most of our time trying to talk our students out of doing that, except it's a structure that is infinitely flexible. And the same thing is true here. You bend it and adjust it to the length that you have, to the story that you're telling, but the idea that you always need a hook and you always need a so what is the most important part. So I want to move on very quickly, talk a little bit about style. These are the kinds of things I look at when I'm editing. I was going to bring in an excerpt of something that I had edited, and then I thought, I don't want to put anybody's work out there that way, but I'm happy to share with you kind of what some of that looks like. First of all, imagine your audience. You're writing for your cousin, you're writing for your next door neighbor, you're not writing for us. You're writing for some, and really try to picture some real person out there who doesn't know the things you know and may not care about them. And part of what you have to do is convince them to care about that. But you want to write in that way. Conversational, warm, fairly informal most of the time. You use I, but it shouldn't be all about you. Even if you're starting with a personal story, if all you have to do is say, well, here's what my experience was, and here's how this affects me, nobody cares. But I should still be present, and that's a difficult balancing act sometimes. Active voice, tight writing, direct sentences, but you all also want variation in your sentence style. So if you've got 5 long sentences in a row, follow with a short one. A lot of this feels really basic to me, but I see in doing my editing how much it's not. Try to make things as concrete as possible by using examples. Illustrate it, explain what you mean. One key thing about public writing that you will have noticed in your reading, but turns out for many academics to be hard to do: no footnotes, no page citations. You make references. In many cases, what you're writing is going to show up online. You can make references by using hyperlinks. You can make references just by naming people in the book that you're citing, even if you're quoting. You know, yes, your college English teachers and your dissertation advisors would slap your wrist for that, but your editor at Working Class Perspectives is going to say thank you for already putting the links in. And if you're using scholarly terms or references, if you feel like they're really necessary, use it, but explain it. And you know, there's a lot of standard language that we use that other people don't understand that looks like plain words. That, of course, no example is coming to me off the top of my head, but that we all know what it means, but you actually mean it differently than other people. So take the time to explain if you can. Tim?
Sure, very quickly, on the first point, C. Wright Mills, the sociologist and the sociological imagination, I think it's at the back of the book, he says, imagine yourself doing a public lecture at your university where you've got your own faculty immediately in your department, including students, the faculty from across the university, but also it's a public lecture, so people from the town can come. And he said, think about looking each one in the eye and thinking, you're not allowed to know what I'm talking about. So it should be, so no one feels patronized, no one feels excluded, and that's true.
Yeah. And I say to my students a lot of the time, if you can't talk about that concept in plain language that your cousin who never went to college would understand, then you don't really understand it. If the only way you can talk about that is to use that piece of jargon, you're in trouble. So it's my judgmental, you know, sorry.
I've been writing academic prose for 60 years more, and I'm good at it. I know what I'm doing. I've been writing a memoir in the 60s now, and translating this way is extraordinarily hard, particularly when you get to the point of revision. My partner, Doris, is a wonderful editor, and one of the things she said to me is, look at your verbs. Look at your verbs. So I start looking at the verbs, and what that does is it forces me to rethink the sentence. And once you begin to rethink the sentence, then you're rethinking what you're writing about. And the looking at the verb is like getting into something that was otherwise boxed out from you as the writer of it in the first place. It has proven to be, for me, just an absolute mind-blowing opportunity of rewriting, writing in a different way. And for other people, that might not work quite the same way. But I do think that it's a useful tactic to look at the verb, and that will get you inside the sentence. And getting inside the sentence allows you to rethink what you're writing.
Yeah.
And I found this is working wonderfully.
That's great. So I'm going to hand it over to John to move to the other half of this. We operate on the assumption that you'll be very successful at your writing for the public, and therefore journalists are going to start to call, what do you do? Your turn, John.
There is a relationship between your writing and journalism. Sherry and I, when we first started the blog, we say, well, why are we doing it? Is anybody reading it? You're sending a bunch of electrons out there, and people are sort of, and then she found that people started calling. And if you Google in working class, you'll see working class perspectives come up pretty high on the list. So it's really, there's something going on here. My remarks are not my own. They're a conjunction of experiences and arguments and discussions that I've had with journalists and been on panels with them. I think the most important one, for this one is Jonathan Kaufman. Jonathan Kaufman was a writer for the Wall Street Journal. He'd come to Youngstown, and as soon as I saw Wall Street Journal, he got vetted before I would do the interview, before I would take him up to steelworkers and to meet people. And he was really, really great. He understood it, and he became part of our lecture series, which, if you go back and look at the history of the lecture series at Youngstown State, for 20 years, we always had a journalist. And the final lecture was by George Packer, who a year later would win the Pulitzer Prize for the Unwinding. So we worked closely with him over the years. And Jonathan has now won another Pulitzer and then went to, he's now dean of the Northeastern University School of Journalism. And he's really, we have an ongoing relationship about reporting. And so a lot of his ideas, I think, are incorporated into this. And the other part, Sherry just mentioned, we have the journalist list of our blog is now at 142. Okay? We've been collecting them over 20 years. You do an interview, you're on the blog. You're on the list. And that sort of repetition and visibility, getting the blog every week is another type of approach. Anyway, I want to start with, Sure, you want to do the buttons here?
Oh, okay.
If you would. And I'm going to try to go through this fast, because one thing I wanted to have more time to talk about is, first of all, I always like to start by talking about where we are, or where you start where people are. And I want to say reporters are workers. Okay? They're under a lot of pressure these days. Technology, restructuring, downsizing, internships, part-time, those are all activities in the newsroom. But sometimes they don't see themselves like that. There was one reporter who called me and asked me a question about why don't these workers take concessions? What's wrong with them? And I said, can we stop? I want you to do me a favor. He said, okay. I want you to look around the newsroom and what do you see? And he said, empty desks. Empty desks, and interns, part-timers. And I said, how would you feel if you were been asked to take concessions right now? He said, oh, I got it. I said, well, I don't think your editor will like that as part of the story, but I want you to start from where you are and what you see happening. And so I think they're feeling a lot of the same sort of pressures that other people are feeling. There's a speed up going on. Not only do they have to write for the print media, often they have to write for social media. And they're being evaluated like that. Now that's an important point for us, because then they're also evaluated in terms of the comments. Okay? Which gives us a way of getting into their mind and stuff. So you have to understand that they're workers too. And they've got a life and they're trained. What's the matter? Scusi? All right. So I want you to sort of start with that sort of position. Then there's two types of reporters. There's beat reporters and there are generalists. And these sort of general reporters don't have a lot of knowledge. Okay? And they need to be educated. And when they went to journalism school, they didn't learn anything about working class. And they're mostly coming from the middle class now. There's not a lot of Jimmy Breslins out there anymore that come out of the sort of the working class. And so they may need more help in terms of what they're doing. They may not be knowledgeable about the issue. So part of your job is going to be to help them get the story right, not just to get your little clip in. Okay? And you may not even make it in. Because I've often said, you don't have to put my name in there. You can do this not for attribution. And then I think you have to understand they're part of an editorial process. And there's a difference between what the writer says and what the editor wants. And there are some, there could be a lot of fight. That is, they have their own bosses to deal with. And also I want you to think about vetting them. If you're going to be asked to do an interview, go look at their work, see what they're saying, and often comment. I was looking at your story. I know that seems like a little gratuitous, but it's very important. These are people, and they like to know that their work is being read. And then the other part of that, there are categories of responses. People don't always know this, but I'll just say it. On the record, on background, off the record, no comment. Okay? If I know a reporter is having trouble with the story, I will do the same thing that Sherry would do in terms of the blog. I said, let's go off the record and talk about it. and then we'll go back on the record. So know how to use these category responses to do this. Okay, Terry, what's the next one? Because I want to make sure we get time. As I said, vet the reporter, listen to their question. If you don't understand it, go off the record and then rephrase it. And that's one sort of thing. Or I sometimes do that sort of word shift that says, well, let me see if I understand what you're asking. Okay? But the typical response is to sort of blurt something out. Respond. So you've got to take some time and sort of to deal with these issues. Now, feel free to ask what they're looking for, maybe different approaches to the question, helps to them better understand what's going on here, or what it means. Some reporters are sort of geared into this, some are not. We had to do a lot of interviews surrounding Hillbilly Elegy, which had a very common narrative. It was really a political book. It wasn't so, a statement about his personal growth. And we had fits over it, and we wrote about it, about trying to deal with the media to sort of understand it. But those narratives are out there, and you have to sort of deal with them. I mean, I have 1,000 stories to tell, but one that really sort of pisses me off is CNN. CNN had seen some of our work. They came to Youngstown to do a story of what's happening politically. And they said, let's go down and do it by the old mill site. I said, I've done that story for 30 years ago. I'm not doing it. Really not going there. I said, I'm not going there. I said, this story is not about what happened in 1980 to 1990. It's about what happened in 2008, 9, 10, in the Great Recession, and what happened. And I did the interview, and they still didn't do it right. The Washington Post sent a reporter, a Pulitzer Prize winner, to do a story on Youngstown's Renaissance. I said, you're out of your mind. 9:30 on a Saturday night, the reporter calls and says, John, the editor doesn't believe the story. I said, I gave you the statistical information. Can you stop and go over it? I said, okay. Call me back in 5 minutes. I'll get it up on my computer. We went over it. Make a long story short, it turned out there were 22,000 jobs lost between late 2007 and when the story was going, and that was more than any 3-year period in the Great Steel Crisis. So they come in with a set of predispositions, and they also have editors that it's not the story that they want. And you have to sort of deal with that. So feel free to sort of ask questions, look at what they're going on, help them better understand what's going on. If you can't answer the questions, suggest other people who could, and often those in sort of working class studies. We've become very good relations with Tim last night, Emma Jacobs of the Financial Times. Why? Because Emma had called Tim for a story, and he said, you should call John and Sherry about this. And then at the same time, we've given the names of other people in working class studies that might help and answer some of those questions. I mean, there's just so many examples of this. I mean, questions about, well, isn't fracking going to increase the number of jobs? Well, yeah, but have you subtracted the coal jobs and the non-carbon jobs that are going to be lost because of this approach? It's not just one particular issue. So, I mean, and I could go through and give you sort of all these examples, but we'd be here all day. All right, how to respond. Sherry mentioned in how you're writing, the same thing. As if you are talking to a friend. Don't pontificate. Don't use jargon. We're sort of reviewing a piece right now that will be appearing, I'm not sure when, for our blog, and the person discusses rent. Rent is an economics term, and one person who's blogged for us, they took 150, 250 words to explain this one economic concept that basically means somebody's charging more money than what the market would bear. You know, so the guy who's writing for us right now did it perfectly. Instead of giving a very long economic, answer. So state your views clearly, succinctly. Reporters have questions. They may be deliberately provocative and reflect a lack of background. So you have to sort of be aware of that. I think it's a type of, sometimes it's with a tai chi, you sort of move it like this or this, and in some cases you've got to use jujitsu and flip them. Okay, in terms of how you're trying to deal with it. But the thing is, it's kind of like when I was teaching negotiations theory, is that you have to be within the conversation and above it. You got to hear and see what's going on at the same time you would be within the context of the discussion. I mean, and there are all sort of issues like this that are very difficult to deal with. What is the working class? What, and I said, well, what do you mean? Well, that should be pretty simple. I said, do you mean the working class in Massachusetts? Do you mean in Alabama? Do you mean the working class that's a white working class? Or do you mean the black working class, or the male working class, or the female working class? All those things that contribute to their clarification of what they want to talk about. When you talk about white working class men, they're not talking about the whole working class, and they're not talking about all the same politics. So that becomes an issue. And part of the danger is, and one of the dangers we've always sort of felt within working class studies, is we don't necessarily privilege class over the other identities. Okay, that's part of the conversation. The type of intersectionality, if you will, as an academic term, I'm not. You guys really did.
Don't use that with the report.
I don't use that, but I learned it from my wife. Or use terms like right now, precarity, or the precariat. Reporters don't understand it. And I mean, Steve Greenhouse, today from the New York Times, had a 3-year fight over the term until David Brooks uses it in an editorial. There is a thing called the precariat, Stephen, and after he retired, he sends me a note and says, all right, let's start using the word precariat. It's a type of insecurity that structures both working class and middle class people, and everybody's sort of feeling it.
But John, that's a good example of a specialized term that you used in the interview, but you took the time to explain it.
Yeah.
It's not that you can't ever use them.
But even he wouldn't use it because he said people won't understand it. I was nodding that once you talk about what's happening in the newsroom with the New York Times, do you have a precariat there? All right. Don't be afraid to disagree with the question or its assumptions behind it. Don't necessarily get into an argument or be combative. There's ways of sort of doing that you can get away with a much larger story and a better understanding. And remember, we're trying to get people to understand working class values, and so you might ask the context that they're trying to use and ask a question. Avoiding errors. Take time to prepare and gather your thoughts. Use, I call the stall. Okay? You're a bunch of grifters here. It's sometimes what you do is, you don't understand the full question. You may not be sure of it. You know it's important. And find a way to say, well, look, I have to do something. And do 15 minutes of research and come back. Okay? It's a stall. Provide names, numbers, and contact information. Let them know you're available for follow-up questions. Get the reporter's contact information so they can provide clarification, additional information. You got to remember that sometimes they say, I'll just write the questions, especially younger journalists. They say, well, I just can't type out the questions for you? And, but remember that those things can be quoted directly. And be aware that they're only going to use a sentence or two. it's part of what you have to do, and you think about it. I'm trying to think of a good example. It's probably the CNN interview when I talked to the reporters and said, I did everything to talk about it's not just the working class that are involved in what was going on in politics. There's a lot of middle class resentment. And I said the politics of resentment. That was the only term that they used in the interview. So, but it's interesting because 8 months later, Fareed Zakaria's producer called me and said, we want to know what we did wrong during the election and reporting on the working class. Don't ask to see the story before publications. Reporters won't do this and it hurts your credibility. All right? Get what you get. Okay? But if you've done your prep work right, you've got a better chance to get it in all right. Familiarity, or did I pass it?
You want to come back to this one?
No, let's go to fiction. No, yeah, let's go to fiction story.
Oh, you didn't.
Okay. I'm trying to get this under. Identifying angle that will interest the audience in the publication you're approaching. What would interest you if you weren't already involved in the issue? When you're doing an attempt to pitch a story for local and regional media, use the local angle. For business media, want an economic or financial angle. If possible, link to the current debate. It is called news. They want it current if they can. And different media have different needs. They have dozens of pitches. For national media, local media, and social media often need content and are able to do it. They need content. And their resources are limited. Pitch a story to columnists, talk show hosts, and newsroom guests. Okay?
John, would you talk just a little bit more about when you have a story idea, when we want to write about something, how do you go about getting it into the American Prospect or the Nation or the Plain? What's that process?
Well, the hard ones, but it's the one that you guys usually would know best, and that's local newspapers. There was a story I wanted to do on the working class in support of Trump and Clinton. And I went in to talk to the editor, I emailed her and said, you interested in the story, I made the pitch. And she said, if you write the story more about what Clinton needs to do to win the working class in Ohio. From that discussion, it was very clear what she wanted. I'm all for it. I know how to do that. And so it helped me frame what she really wanted to do. So, but the idea, okay, and this is where Sherry started her discussion, it's overcoming fear and risk-taking and rejection. Okay? And you gotta get over it. All right, let's go to familiarity. As you go through this process, establish your own context. Again, we got to this large journalist network because we just grabbed their email address. And that sort of presentation, get a blog every week for 44 weeks, you're in the game. Some of them will just blow it off. Some of them will read it to be interested. You have to sort of, establish those contexts. And one way to also do that is to, when they do a story, write them and say, I really like that. Think you did a good job in covering that. Okay? So I thought you might be interested in this. Okay? We're really proactive on this stuff. It's not a passive sort of action here. When you create your own network as an outlet for your blogs and your work, try to work with reporters and editors whom you know or who you've worked with before. Establish those contacts. And that's not easy these days because, I'm like Paul, I'm a little older now, 72. And a lot of the people that I worked with are retired. And so you're continually updating. I'm not as old as Jack. But I'm just, we continue updating that list. And have someone who knows reporters, editors, or producers make contact for you. This improves your chances of credibility. But you gotta get out in front of this. And you gotta risk something. Lastly, if you're not quoted after the interview, don't take it personally, okay? It's just part of it. And if you've got only so many column inches to do your story in the print media, you're not gonna, it may not get there. The idea is to get the story as straight as you can. Yeah?
I just want to add one thing to that, which is don't assume that if you're not quoted, that you're taking the time to talk to a reporter wasn't worthwhile. You probably had a really important role in shaping the story. Getting quoted should not be your measure of whether it mattered and whether it was worth it.
If they got the story right. All right. Establish the contacts to be placed on the media's resource list as helpful sources. I mean, a lot of times the reporters share their resource lists within the newsroom. The risk-taking and rejection are part of the process. I want to stress that. And identify yourself as a working-class studies scholar. It was interesting, the piece I wrote on Pittsburgh, it was a 4,000-word piece for the American Prospect. I identified Kathy Newman not as a professor of media studies at Carnegie Mellon University. I simply said she's a working-class studies scholar, at Carnegie Mellon. Okay? You're not only building your contacts with the media, you're also building the field itself. So I think that gives us 5 minutes, and I'm sorry that we took so long because we wanted to take more time for questions, but that's where I'm going to stop. Questions? Dr. Metzger.
What do you do when you have something in at one place, and I'm thinking probably a longer piece, but they're diddling around with it, and then it's getting unfresh as a news angle. So you have to push enter sometimes.
This is exactly.
Sounds like something we're going through right
now with the nation. It's a really great piece, and it's on a man who was an illegal immigrant for 20 years. Trump got behind him because he was a businessman and created jobs, and CNN and all these people came in to do the story in Youngstown, and so it was a really good thing, feel-good story for Youngstown. Meanwhile, nobody's saying about the 2,000 illegal immigrants that are housed in the city that provide tax base for city services. It was in, the editors loved it, it went through fact-checking, hard. Sherry went nuts. She's an editor, and this went fact-checking with Core Civic, which is the Corrections Corporation of America. We're going to talk to them. But we did a very long one, and then suddenly it stopped. Yeah. We don't know. We know it's there.
So what's the answer to his question?
Right. The question of it is that you either have to, fish or cut bait. Okay. You go. You either push the editor for a decision one way or the other. When is it going to go in? When isn't it? You have to understand there's a lot of intervening events, especially in the last 3 weeks, that they may be more current, they may be waiting for the right moment. So otherwise you say, I'm going to withdraw the piece. I withdrew a piece from the Plain Dealer, where they diddled around with it, and I said, I'm going to withdraw now. It's no longer timely.
I suppose this is just a cautionary warning for anybody that be thinking about doing it. Sometimes if you write for the media, for the Guardian, for example, in the UK, they often give you 530 words, which is quite short. But that's fine. You can make a short point. Problem is, as an academic, if you make a point within 530 words, you can get other academics that will absolutely pull you to pieces because you didn't say this or you didn't do this. I've written quite a lot in the media. I get absolutely slated by other academics,
No, I think
Yeah,
within the academic community, when you're published in, you're publicly, it's hand-to-hand combat.
And
Because
sometimes in the public too. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the risk of this, and this is part of why many of us are afraid of it, is I know that if I go out there, if my academic colleagues are going to critique something I'm doing, they'll do it in the politesse of academic work, right? It'll be this is a comment, not a question in your session, where what they're really saying in very nice and polite ways is you're full of crap. What in public, partially you'll get critique from other academics who've never tried to write something in 500 words and don't know how to do it. And partially you may open yourself up to critique this day and age from general readers. We've gotten some of that too, where, and you have to just know that that's part of the game. That rejection thing that John was talking about, dealing with the risk and rejection. If you're not ready to do that, don't do this. Because you're going to get it from one side or another or both.
You guys should know that you're in the presence of the Illuminati. We did a piece that got pushed in so
That explains it.
And all these sort of hate mail from liberals.
Including family members, by the way.
Including family members. So we got, this has been a real, there are risks. But if you're going to build a field, and you're going to have an activist part of it, you got to take the risks. We ask working people to take risks, and those of us like Paul and I who come out of labor studies background, we always join a union, we have them take risks. Sometimes if we ask our fellow faculty members to join a faculty union, oh my God, no. It's because they're unwilling to engage in risk-taking. And it's particularly, I'm not being, have a position to talk about this, given a retired faculty member. But you have to understand that faculty members are very vulnerable now because they too are workers.
Yeah.
So we understand the hesitancy about doing blogs and doing this quite publicly, but it needs to be done because otherwise they're turning to people like who do hillbilly elegy, and that have a sort of common narrative that's all wrong. Not necessarily all wrong, but a one version of it that bases itself on a sort of a morality tale and your mobility. That if you do all the right things and you're not a drug addict like my mothers and fathers, he talks about.